I used daily data from 8 exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, to describe changing market behavior. An ETF is a basket that holds many stocks and trades like one stock. The project compared market days using price returns, volatility, trading volume, trend, and drawdown. Machine learning then grouped similar days, compared several methods, learned the main grouping rule, and tested whether the results stayed similar after small changes. The report began with an abstract, which was the entire project summarized. The research statement gave the exact question. The conjecture explained what I expected before running tests. Related work described earlier research. The contribution section explained what this project added. Methodology explained the steps in the system. Experimental design recorded the data, settings, and tests. Results showed what happened. Discussion explained the limits, and the conclusion gave the main answer. The main question was whether a small set of daily market measurements could reveal repeated kinds of market behavior. I expected principal component analysis, or PCA, to compress the 48 measurements into a smaller set of useful summaries. I expected K-means, a method that places similar days into groups to find repeated states. I expected a random forest which combines many decision trees that vote to learn the K-means labels. I also expected small changes to leave most labels unchanged. These models created labels that were called pseudo-regimes because they were not official economic labels. The base paper used PCA, K-means, and classification with 48 macroeconomic measurements. It suggested that future work could use asset-specific measurements and other clustering methods. This project followed that suggestion. It used ETF price and volume features instead of economic reports. It added T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, or TSNE, and uniform manifold approximation and projection, or UMAP, as two-dimensional visualization methods. It also added a Gaussian mixture model, or GMM, which creates probability-based groups with more flexible boundaries. The data includes 8 ETFs from January 1st, 2005 through June 30th, 2026. The group includes the broad market, growth, and technology, and smaller companies and several business sectors. SPY was the main broad market ETF shown in the report. Each ETF file contains 5,406 daily observations. Dates through December 31st, 2018 formed the training period, while dates beginning January 2nd, 2019 formed the separate test period. Keeping later dates out of training prevented the future market information from influencing the earlier model. The raw files were checked for missing values, duplicated data, invalid prices, incorrect high and low values, and unusual volume. 7 IWM volume values had 1,000 times unit mismatch and were corrected in a separate recorded step. 6 measurements were calculated for each ETF, creating 48 features across 5,344 complete dates. The measurements described a 1-day return, 5-day return, 20-day volatility, unusual trading volume, distance from a recent average price, and distance below a recent high. Every measurement used only the current day and earlier days. The process began with checked daily price and volume data. Those values became the 48 time-based features. These dates were divided into training and test periods. Standardization placed different measurements on comparable scales. PCA was then fitted on only the training rows. After that, the PCA results were frozen, meaning they were not changed during the later phases. K-means created the main labels. GMM supplied an alternative grouping. PCA, TSNE, and UMAP supplied different pictures of the data. Random forest learned only the K-means labeling rule. Each experiment answered a different question. PCA and K-means asked how many clear groups the training data supported. The visualization experiment asked which two-dimensional picture best preserved nearby points and displayed the existing labels. The k-means and GMM comparison asked whether the different ideas about group shape produce different results. Random Forest asked whether the k-means rule could be repeated on later dates. Stability testing asked whether different random starting points or tiny input changes caused many labels to move. Each question required its own measurements. The main model settings were fixed before final testing. PCA kept enough summary components to preserve at least 90% of the training variation. K-means tested 2 through 6 groups and used 100 starting attempts. TS&E used a neighborhood setting called Perplexity 30. UMAP used 30 neighbors. GMM used 2 flexible shared probability groups and 20 starting attempts. Random Forest used 500 decision trees. These settings are called hyperparameters because they control how a method works. The seed 7267 gave the random parts of the programs the same starting instructions each time. The 8 ETFs gave several views of the market without making the project too large to explain. 1, 5, 20, and 63-day windows roughly represents daily, weekly, monthly, and quarterly behavior. The later test period included conditions before, during, and after the COVID market disruption. K-means and GMM used the same PCA data and the same number of groups. That made the comparison fair only because the grouping method changed. The 63-row gap in validation matched the longest feature window and reduced overlap between the training and validation dates. PCA kept adding summary components until it preserved at least 90% of the training variation. Variation means the amount of changing information in the original data. Principal component 14 brought the total to just above 90%, so 14 components were kept. K-means then tested several possible group counts. The scores for 2 groups were 0.414, 3 groups scored 0.281, 4 groups scored 0.277, 5 groups scored 0.245, while 6 groups only scored 0.136. A silhouette score measures whether a point is closer to its own group rather than to other groups. Higher is better, and 2 groups were the clear winner. Random Forest accuracy ranged from about 81% to completely accurate, with a mean of 96% accurate. Balanced accuracy gave equal importance to both groups. How many major groups of similar market days appeared naturally? I tested several possibilities. The strongest result was 2 groups. I simply called them Cluster 0 and Cluster 1. The market history could be summarized well by these 2 different kinds of days. Only after the grouping was finished did I examine the measurements inside of each group and give them descriptions. Cluster 0 contained about 16% of the dates. It usually had lower returns, weaker price trends, deeper drawdowns, higher volatility, and higher trading volume. For that reason, it was described as stress-like. Cluster 1 contained about 83% of the dates and showed the opposite average pattern. So, it was described as routine. On the SPY timeline, stress-like labels often appeared around sharp declines and unstable periods. These names describe the feature patterns. The visualization methods had different strengths. Trustworthiness measured how well points that were close in the original data stayed close in the picture. TS&E had the highest trustworthiness, so it best preserved the small local neighborhoods. PCA showed the clear separation of the K-means labels, but that was partly expected because K-means had used PCA data. UMAP gave a useful middle result and could place latter test dates into the learned picture. GMM was often confident in its own choices, but it agreed with K-means on only about 78% of dates. Different methods therefore found different boundaries. Random Forest used the retained PCA components to reproduce the K-means labels. The groups were uneven. About 16% of the dates were stress-like, and 83% were routine. Balanced subsampling made the rarer stress-like group count more during training. A minimum leaf size of 5 meant that the decision tree could not create a final rule from fewer than 5 training examples. This reduced memorization of small accidents in the data. On the untouched test period, balanced accuracy was 99%, with only 7 disagreements across more than 1,800 dates. The time series validation did not shuffle dates. In the first fold, random forest trained on only 518 earlier observations and was checked on later dates from July 25th, 2007 through November 3rd, 2009. Later folds had more history available, so their results generally improved. All unused predictions produced an out-of-fold balanced accuracy of about 91%, while the final untouched test period reached about 99%. The adjusted RAND index or ARI compared two sets of labels. One meant they matched exactly. Seed tests produced an ARI of 1, and small noise tests stayed very close to 1. The project therefore produced a stable two-state description of changing market behavior.